Afternoon to you all, and you're all very welcome. My name is Tom Geraghty. I'm a Deputy Chair of the Labour Court, and I'm chairing this session today, which is on the subject of social dialogue, and we have two very distinguished speakers to speak to us on the subject, following which we'll have a questions and answers session. I'll have a few words to say about the question and answer session when we get there. The first speaker that I'd like to introduce is Danny McCoy. Danny is Chief Executive Officer of IBEC. You have a summary of his CV in the programme, so I'm not going to run through it. But I would like to extend a very special welcome to Danny on behalf of the Society, because this is obviously something of an away venue for him, and he's very welcome. And indeed, it would be fair to say that you couldn't have dialogue unless you have two parties. So Danny's presence here today is absolutely vital to the subject under discussion. And thank you very much for giving up your Sunday afternoon, Danny. Okay, that's enough out of me, I think, Danny, other than to say that if anybody in government wanted to contact anybody on the employer side to find out their views on the subject that we're going to discuss, it would be Danny's telephone that would ring. So we're very lucky to have him here and to hear from him directly on this subject. So thank you very much, and Danny, go ahead, please, if you just take the mic up here.
Thanks very much, Tom. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks to Jack as well originally for inviting me, so I very much appreciate this. So very briefly, for those who may not know, IBEC is an amalgam of the Irish Confederation of Irish Industry and the Federation Union of Employers, so a trade union of employers. So obviously the counterpart, as Tom said, in many of the third-party institutions, we will be representing business with the trade union movement on the other side as part of the Labour Court Workplace Relations Commission, but also in a tripartite context with the government in the formulated Labour Employer Economic Forum, which has been in place now for about 7 years and probably had its main testing ground during COVID, where quite a number of initiatives came forward on what I might call the social dimension, and that's something that I refer to maybe just to start a conversation in a few moments. I'm 14 years CEO of IBEC, backdrop in economics before that. So obviously 2009 was an interesting year to get the job, you know, to paraphrase Emily Dickinson. We could not stop for the IMF, but they kindly stopped for us. And so there's been quite an interesting decade and a half in terms of transformation of the backdrop to the business, to the employer-employee relationship. I had the good privilege of giving the Markovich lecture last year. I know Seamus Dooley gave this year's one on Friday. I'm sorry to miss that. My Markovich lecture was referring to the phenomenon I think that's been really significant over the last decade globally, but Ireland being absolutely the most dramatic country in which this has occurred, is what might be best described as a disembodied economy. And by the disembodiment, I mean, in this front, that very significantly we see that one of the big drivers of economic value, particularly in the last decade and a half, certainly post the great financial crash, is that a lot of corporate value is embedded through intangible assets on balance sheets. So the intangibility, that's the aspect of disembodiment I'm referring to. The intangibility on corporate balance sheets globally has in a generation moved in that kind of 80-20 rule. You know, back in the 70s, corporate balance sheets would have been very heavily 80% tangible assets, and obviously with a physical location or a factory, which would allow organized labor a much more kind of habeas corpus or a place to go to. And as we move this on, we see that globally, particularly since the great financial crash, that the largest companies in the world now have very little tangible assets. It's all these intangible intellectual property assets, be they patents, licenses, copyright, code. And that disembodiment makes a very significant difference in a backdrop, and particularly in our economy, to some of the things we've been grappling with or need to grapple with, perhaps as representatives of society. This globalization and this disembodiment is a very unique backdrop. And so one of the features that probably gets very little attention or discussion, particularly in our media, they'll talk about the corporate tax revenues, no doubt, but even just take that as a kind of an exercise in numbers for a moment. One thing we know, give or take, the wages and salaries bill in Ireland at the moment, wages and salaries constitute about 130 billion euros, right? 130,000 million euros. We're now about 2.6 million. I can't do those maths that easily in my head, but you're looking at somewhere in the order around 50,000 on average to go back to the kind of the incomes off that wage and salaries bill. So keeping that in mind, the 130. The other number that's out there at the moment is the corporate tax return, which again, just around it, 25 billion is the number you'll be hearing on the Sunday shows at the moment. The effective corporate tax rate is trending at about 10% at the moment. Headline rate 12.5%, but by the time capital write-offs and so on. So 10% giving you 25 billion means that the net profitability is 250 billion. And that's net profits because the gross profits are higher again because of those capital write-offs. What you're getting at there is the share of profit in this society dwarfs the share of wages and salaries. That's a very, very unusual scenario globally. And in fact, in some of the industrial manufacturing bases, this industrialization 4.0, particularly in those companies that did really well during COVID, were really stood up and really important to society, like biopharma and medtech. The kind of ratios there will move towards more than 90% profitability to 10%, even though in the 10% wages and salaries, those salaries in those industries will be certainly premium in the society. I just give these as a kind of just a warm-up in the context of what's really been changing in our society and the difficulty to have a social compact in that scenario. And then the final thing I might just talk about in the last 3 or 4 years is that this explosion of corporate balance sheet movement into Ireland was a result of the OECD work on corporate tax revenue. And just as a sidebar, excuse me, just a sidebar, some of you will be listening to changes in the corporate tax environment even the last week and will come in the budget. One of the features that's about to be rolled out internationally, these Pillar 1, Pillar 2 of the OECD, is that the effective minimum corporate tax rate will be 15%. And as I say, not a lot of people think about this, but as I said at the start, the effective corporate tax rate at the moment in Ireland works out about 10%. The 15% will be the minimum. We won't be able to go lower than that. And so if nothing else changed, I'm not saying that nothing else will change, but let's say you retrospected that to 1 year ago, then the corporate tax revenue in Ireland will increase by 50%. It'll go from 10% to 15%. Your 25 billion will be coming in at 37.5 billion, just by that change alone. As I said, it requires the base not to change and all of that, but the likelihood is this corporate tax revenue is as likely to go up as it is to go down in any short-term fashion. However, the difficulties in our economy at the moment is that when you look at that kind of windfall, and my own personal view is all corporate tax revenue should be treated as windfall. Right now, there's a bit of a sterile debate of making it up as you go along. So the government has said half of it is windfall. So we can't rely on half of it, and that half will go off to some sovereign wealth fund or possibly a national infrastructure fund or whatever. It may well be best to see these things as non-sustainable, so don't build your base on that front. So if that is the case, then the speculated on surpluses for this year, which would be about 13 billion, if that 25 billion wasn't in place, we'd flick around to having a 12 billion deficit on our public finances. So in fact, when some people talk about the stability of our taxation system, that we won't repeat the mistakes of the Celtic Tiger and be overexposed to a particular type of tax, that time property taxes, they're inconsistent in how they're talking about the corporate tax, because the same people will say, can't rely upon this, and we won't make the mistakes of the past, and yet here they are making exactly that mistake. And then the last piece, to hand it on to Kevin, or back to you, Tom, rather, is that in the last couple of years, on the back of this really significant meteor that kind of hit Ireland, and it hit Ireland really dramatically post the financial crash, because one of the features of the OECD work in corporate tax is people had to move their balance sheet, the corporate balance sheet, to a jurisdiction of substance. So the Caribbean islands didn't have that substance. There were mainly American companies out for a good time in the Caribbean, and they didn't want to go back to the States because it'd be heavily penalized through the corporate tax regime then in situ in the United States, which is still fairly penalizing. So they came to Europe. And that tournament took off in 2010, 11, 12, and 13. And the two countries that had the greatest share of that was the United Kingdom and Ireland. And the reasons, apart from it being an Anglo-Saxon model in the Caribbean islands, actually pivots around the common law legal system, in contrast to Europe with codified law. Because all of these things are novelty. All of these companies are really novel in terms of their AI and their intangible assets. And so common law legal systems are much more flexible in interpretation on these intangible assets than codified, who tend to be slower to come up with novelty. And so right up to 2014, Britain and Ireland were in this tournament together. And then in 14, the United Kingdom did something that doesn't get enough acknowledgement. They created an uncertainty about the breakup of the United Kingdom, and that was the Scottish referendum vote. That was a freezing effect on investment. And the fact that Cameron then the morning after that result, maintaining the United Kingdom, introduced the uncertainty of a date for Brexit. And so again, what we observed then is 2015 became this famous leprechaun economics jibe about Ireland. We see the corporate balance sheets went up by 40%, the profit and loss extraction from those balance sheets went up 35%, reflected in GDP. That GDP doubled to the point of COVID and has gone up another 40%. Since COVID, there are now 12% more people at work. And fundamentally, in the last 15 years, give or take, we've had an increase of about 1 million people in our workforce, and they've nearly all been in the private sector and not in the public sector, which is very strange because as society gets richer, it likes to have its public services personified. So to have more teachers, have more health, have more security, have more regulators, have more planners. And so against that backdrop, this is a very shifting space. And then the final piece would be, myself and Kevin can talk a little bit about this, is that one of the things I've certainly been trying to do in LEAF is to talk about the social wage. In addition to what we might call the traditional wage, is there a role for employers on a social wage? And how do we actually mediate that? Because what we've observed in the last couple of years, particularly as a result of the time that the now Taoiseach spent in the Department of Enterprise, we've had a whole host of social wage type things coming forward. They haven't actually been a wage in the way I define wage, which is related to your hours work given and paid for by your employer. Some of these could be deemed to be social expenditure items, but their cost ultimately will come back and be contingent upon the wage bill of the employer. And these are things like statutory sick pay, right to disconnect, right to remote work, auto-enrollment for pensions, living wage, and a whole plethora of leaves. These are all, cumulatively, are beginning to build. And if you had none of those things in place as an employer, and we're starting up, they're the equivalent of a 9 percentage point increase on employers' PRSI. So instead of 11%, it's more like 20%. But it's by stealth in that regard. And it's not buying anything in the relationship at the level of the firm, neither for the employer, and I would argue for the union movement either. It's a government in a time of plenty loading on these costs. And these all have merit. But the question is the mechanism by which it's done, I don't believe, is sustainable, particularly for a social dialogue construct. And so that's one of the difficulties that we've had with LEAF in the last number of years. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. It might be useful, Danny, before I ask Kevin to come in, if you could maybe just expand your thoughts a little bit to the question of social dialogue and the role it could play in dealing with the matters that you've identified.
Yeah, sorry, I'm conscious of handing on the ball a little bit, but so one of the features of that unique set of circumstances that I talked about is how do you mediate how this expenditure, public expenditure in particularly, can be distributed in a way that underpins this economic model that we find ourselves with the good fortune of having it in place. So right now, in terms that John Kenneth Galbraith described it, I think that Ireland's living through a situation of private affluence and public squalor. And I think that's becoming more evident day by day as we see the hollowing out. And so, much to the surprise of many, I've been a big fan of social dialogue right through my 14 years, fell on deaf ears for quite a considerable period of time during the Michael Noonan, Enda Kenny period. But just at the end of that, I think they started to see some of the virtues of trying to mediate some of the difficulties that were emerging in our society. The structures are being embryonic, but haven't really, to my liking, got as far as they could, because some of those things would be to ensure that in delivering auto-enrollment and delivering all of these items, that it is known that it's at the level of the workplace that these things are being paid for, and that there's a conversation about how do we sustainably, combining wage increases and these social wage increases, do them in tandem. Right now, and this is really coming forward, we will see that the wage bill is being pushed up very dramatically, and at the moment, the society can sustain it. But there will be days when the tide will go out, and we'll have a very significant high cost, high waged, both in terms of social and private wage economy, which could have been mediated better through a social dialogue than the way it's gone at the moment, which is government talks to us but still likes to spend this money. But I would contend that they're not spending it very well, and they're certainly not addressing the real issue, is that we actually have deficits in our public finances if you take these windfalls that they say we're having out of the equation. And I think social dialogue has certainly proved its mettle during COVID. We needed a speedy response in terms of getting the temporary wage subsidy scheme in place, but also a whole slew of other issues. And then, as crucially, getting people back to work in a safe return to work protocols and so on. So I think it has shown, even its modern form, that it can address issues, and when they're acute, like COVID, or maybe even like Brexit, they can come forward. But my view is that we actually have more chronic problems, and that chronic problem is this private affluence and public squalor. And so the surprise for lots of people is that I'm not actually calling for a big state. I'm calling for people to acknowledge that the state is shrinking in front of our eyes. And whatever your desired level of state, at least fess up that it's shrinking. And that seems inconsistent because the government has so much money and appears to be giving lots of money to people in various ways at the moment. But in truth, it is definitely shrinking, and it's being dwarfed by the private sector. And the very last one is that for an Irish audience, we always get the investments back in the 1920s in a hydropower station, Ardnacrusha. Like, we're so far from Kansas now, we're so far from Ardnacrusha, you could have stood on the top of Ardnacrusha and not see anything. If you stand on top of the Children's Hospital, which is the exemplar at the moment, you'll see something way bigger, which is what Intel have been doing just a few miles away. Much bigger investment, using a lot more resources in terms of construction, etc. And look the other direction to see right across around the canals, the cranes. So what that tells you is the government has got too small for the scale of its economy. The private sector can outbid our government on all of those projects. And so, realization of where you are and having a social dialogue about how you might actually identify resources, I think, is well capable, and people are mature enough to do it in this society. It's a wasted opportunity to address that chronic issue of how this good thing that's happening us in terms of money is really starting to erode our social fabric, and in time could erode our democratic structures as well. So I think there's a chronic issue that social dialogue could help at least have a go at addressing.
Thanks very much, Danny. Some interesting observations there. Our next speaker is Kevin Callanan, whom I suspect most of you probably know. Kevin is a former colleague of mine in Forsa, General Secretary of Forsa, and he recently stepped down as President of the ICTU, and he's also Chairman of the Public Services Committee. So he has his fingers in lots of pies and therefore is in a good position to offer a trade union perspective on the topic of social dialogue. Go ahead, Kevin.
Thanks, Tom, and good afternoon, everyone. I mentioned to Tom just before we came in here that the subject headings seem to be very loose, as in social dialogue discussion. So I want to start by just telling you a little anecdote about back in 2015, there was a piece of correspondence for a couple of months on the agenda of the Congress Executive Council. And it was an invitation from the Singaporean government to participate in a conference, and it was a conference to celebrate 50 years of Singaporean independence and 50 years of Singaporean tripartism. And a similar invitation had gone to the employers and to the Irish government. And at one of these, this obviously hadn't been actioned for a couple of months, but when it was back around again, it was actually the late Larry Broderick, who, just nice to remember here today, he was sitting beside me and said, "Kevin, would you go to that?" And he proposed me, and I was sent off, and one of Danny's colleagues went along. And what was happening was a one-day conference, very high level. They had like lots of government people. They had Guy Ryder from the Director General of the ILO present. And it was a one-day conference on the Monday before their four-yearly Trade Union Confederation Congress conference. Now, the less said about Singaporean democracy and trade unionism, the better. But what made it interesting was that they had selected 4 countries as case studies, if you like, to look at tripartism, Ireland being one, the others being Denmark, Japan, and Barbados. And I still remember the presentation from the Barbadian Minister for Health. She opened her presentation with this little video of a beachy cove flanked with 2 pine trees and the lapping waves coming in, and she won the presentations hand down on that one. But the point I'm trying to make is, like, there was huge differences between what tripartism meant in each of those countries, including Singapore. So I think what we have to focus on here is, well, what kind of social dialogue should we have, do we need, and how could it be most effective? I was struck reading yesterday by the Taoiseach's comment, maybe the day before or earlier in the week, in response to the farmers, where he said something along the lines of, well, what we need with the farmers is what we have with the trade unions and the employers, where we sit down and we agree how to solve problems. Well, I think Danny has touched on this as well. That doesn't seem to me to be what we have in the form of the chief, I suppose, social dialogue vehicle now, the LEAF, the Labour Employer Economic Forum, which isn't to say that it isn't better than when we started. Obviously, it's better that there is a social dialogue unit within the Department of the Taoiseach now. It's better that the Taoiseach chairs the meetings, and the meetings in general are well attended by the senior members of government. All of that is good, and it's also true to say that there have been very useful exchanges at those meetings. Most notably, I think, in my memory, last September, prior to the budget, where we had a very, very active exchange with the government members about what needed to happen in the budget. And certainly they've indicated subsequent to that that dialogue influence some of their decisions. But it's still very much consultative rather than executive in nature, and it seems to me very limited. And that, I think, has its origin in political decisions, but also in the way in which things have developed at a European level. So understandably enough, I think while we were grappling with the scale of crisis that we were facing in the years from 2008 onwards, right into 2012, 13 and 14, a lot of things were happening at European level that probably were missed by a lot of us. So we got the new fiscal rules and the EU semester process, among other things. And there's no question that we were not really, there was a box ticking exercise. We were not really fully involved, certainly as trade unions in that process. It's a little bit better now, but when you look at the process itself, you know, we put in our submissions, but does it really result in any change in what the government was going to do anyway? I think probably not. So to an extent, the evolution of the LEAF was a response, I think, to the requirement at a European level to do something in relation to social dialogue. And just to mention COVID, because when COVID struck, we saw, you know, quite a rapid change. So it's not just, you know, at a national level, the way in which the PUP and the temporary wage subsidy scheme and the return to work protocol were all introduced following the involvement of the social partners within days and weeks. I mean, think about when COVID struck really in late February 2020, when the Taoiseach at the time, Varadkar, came down the steps of Blair House in Washington to address the nation. I think it was around the 12th of March. And then we saw the lockdown kind of later in March. I know Joe Cunningham and myself had, you know, we co-authored a piece that was published in the Irish Times, I think in late April, you know, asking the question, could this be our 1945 moment? And we saw, I think, the return to work protocol ready to be introduced by May or June of that year. So within a few months, all of that catastrophe had happened and had been faced and had been, you know, planned for. And I think that illustrates just the potential of social dialogue if you get it right. In fact, I mean, just to refer back to the social partnership era for a moment, and it's not, and I suppose lest there be any doubt about this, it's not that anybody, I think, on either the employer or the trade union side wants to return to national pay agreements. But when social partnership collapsed, I do think the know-how, the knowledge, the relationships were instrumental in agreements being reached, both in the form of the Croke Park Agreement in early 2010 in the public sector and the accord in the private sector around pay. And I think, again, that points to the positives. From a trade union point of view, there's no doubt that the years of social partnership had a very deleterious effect on activism. And there was certainly, in general, a lack of awareness as to what trade unions were trying to do through social partnership agreements, and little credit given for that. So I think there's a big question to be asked and answered in relation to how do we educate and politicize members in terms of how we bring them forward in relation to social dialogue. So one thing I think, though, that we should be able to agree on as labour market actors is that, particularly in a small country, a small island like this that is vulnerable to exogenous shocks, is the importance of resilience and sustainability. And that, you know, we have seen too often in our history, very short history as a state, the 30s, the 50s, the 80s, and then 2008-9, and then again with COVID, the kind of scale of shock that can happen and what it means. I think there is a case for the actors to work together, and for that to happen, you need the right institutions, and for those institutions to work, you need a high level of trust. It's my view that we're still a long way away from that, and it's ironic in a way that while we certainly don't agree on everything, that there has been a very significant amount of agreement between employers and unions on the social dialogue issues in recent years, most notably with comments that Danny has made, and that the weaker leg of the stool, if you like, is the government one. And as well as the leaf, I suppose there are a few vestiges of the old social partnership structures in place. One is the NESC, another is what's now the National Competitiveness and Productivity Council, and I served on that as one of the 2 trade union nominees from 2015 to 2021. And for the entirety, now this is very much a business-dominated forum with advisors from senior officials right across maybe 9 or 10 government departments. But right from my time, and probably from before my time on the Competitiveness Council, there was common case among all of us about the importance of the housing issue, about the huge importance of the childcare issue, about education and training. And all of those issues, before they rose to the top of the political agenda certainly in the last election and possibly in the years preceding that. So the politicians have been much slower, I think, to recognize these as crucial issues, and more worryingly, they have been very slow to, and still haven't managed to crack them. So I think the case for a deeper form of social dialogue is a very strong one. I think we have missed an opportunity that was very evident in 2020 when COVID struck. We saw that reflected not just in the way in which the debt break at a European level was relaxed. We saw in the way that they suspended the normal semester process. We had much better country-specific recommendations for 1 year. In fact, even if you compare the speech of 3 years ago of Ursula von der Leyen and what she was saying with her speech this week, the worrying part of that is, are we seeing some kind of signal of a return to austerity? Certainly the value of working with social partners seems to have been less amplified anyway in the remarks. And obviously now with the cost of living crisis, the fact that we have a weaker social wage, and there is, as Danny has pointed to, probably a need for a debate about what constitutes a social wage, and certainly we probably have different perspectives on that. I think there's the fact that we have such a weak social wage, given the strength of the economy, means that all of the heavy lifting really falls to pay bargaining. And ironically, at a time when we have a buoyant exchequer revenues, healthy profits across many parts of the economy, and in some of the areas that Danny has alluded to, like it's unbelievable, compared to what we would have traditionally saw as the balance between labor and capital. The fact that we have historically low unemployment and more people than ever at work at a time when living standards are falling is just hard to credit. So I think there is still time for a big idea. I read Pat Leahy's piece in the Irish Times, not yesterday, but Saturday before, where he was bemoaning, or seemed to be bemoaning, the absence of a big idea. Well, maybe the big idea is kind of staring us in the face. And if we're going to successfully and effectively and efficiently address the kind of challenges that we have, some of which include the digital transformation that is taking place but is going to accelerate, the climate crisis, the need to ensure that we get levels of collective bargaining coverage that are more appropriate to a country like this, and finally, but not exclusively, to address the fact that, you know, we need to prepare for a new Ireland. You could say, might be too much to say we need to prepare for unity, but we certainly need to be approaching issues on the basis of an all-Ireland dimension. And given the unique role of the trade union movement as a single all-Ireland federation, I think we're in a particularly good place to do that.
Thanks very much, Kevin. I'm not sure, Jack, how much time do we have? I know this started a little bit late. 3 o'clock, okay, that's very good. We have a few hands in the air for questions, and that's what we're going to move to now. Just sit down for a second, Pat, just wait, patience. Now, I just want to say, partially because we are stuck a little bit for time, but also because this is not the forum for speeches. I will cut you short if you start making speeches. This is a question and answer session designed to elicit the views of the two people who are invited along here today. So Pat, now's your chance. You can ask your question. Go ahead.
Thanks for your kind guidance, Chair. I'm Pat Bulger. I'm a retired official out of Impact, but I'm still a member of Forza, and I'm a trustee of this organisation. And Danny, I'm very pleased to see you here because I suppose I'm from a union that believes in engagement. So now, I just want to ask you one question really, and probably two parts to it. Kevin referred to it, but did you hear Ursula von der Leyen's speech on the State of the Union on commitments to social dialogue and for social partners to be involved in implementing solutions? And what do you think the substance of that actually is? And what ideas will IBEC and Business Europe come up with for new employment rights in the context of potential points of mediation? Or I know it converges by the remarks you've made, so I was fascinated by what you said actually.
Thanks, Pat. Well, I didn't hear it live and had it synopsized for me, so if the person who synopsized it for me heard it properly. It has been a trend in this commission, though, to advance social dialogue as the preferred form of consultation and negotiation, and we saw that with the Minimum Wage Directive, which has been very influential in the LEAF process here, and we've made some advancement, I think, here about collective bargaining coming in on a number of elements. We can go through that another day, but certainly from the business community, even on collective bargaining, are certainly moving, and IBEC has been trying to move that on. As you know, we could have a constitutional referendum on collective bargaining as a possibility, depending on who's in power. We'd be very concerned about that. Not so much in the essence of the thing itself, but in terms of the property rights issues, which come much more generally. So, on the Business Europe, I think there's still a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, Pat, of the industrialised narrative still remains the same as it was in the 80s, and I think it's probably got a bit worse because of the energy cost crisis in Europe in particular. There's a fear that industrialization in Europe is leaving, and particularly being attracted now to the States with their Inflation Reduction Act, which is really a form of trying to get industry there. So certainly taken by von der Leyen. Not sure about it in a European context where it's going to work, but it's certainly influencing the way we think about it here and why we need a solution in terms of raising the level of collective bargaining coverage. Could I say one thing as well, Tom, just as kind of slightly related to this, is The thing that actually triggered, and still does, and I still remind people, because COVID tends to push it away in terms of policy making, the thing that disturbed me most on the need for the agenda that I'm pushing, which seems to be very socialist for a lot of my members, was actually the farmers' dispute in 2019 around the meat factories. It wasn't the essence of the dispute, but the fact that farming, which was part of the social dialogue structure and the social partnership structure, has dissipated in a very uncomfortable way. And while collectivism is coming forward, we'd be much more, I certainly would, and I think IBEC would, be much more comfortable with collectivism with a left-wing socialist tint than collectivism coming from a right-wing tint. And I think that was the first demonstration of it. What was disturbing about that is that farmers obviously protest. That's not that particularly news. But the government took them into Ag House to negotiate on a Sunday night for a settlement, to realise that the hostage taker never had a hostage to start with. There was nobody that could go back out in the streets that they were leading. So there was a rabble. And I think that's a real danger, that if you don't have these structures in your society, that we will get a really bad, uncoordinated outcome. So I see the danger of right-wing collectivism as a fairly potent threat to the Irish way of doing things. So that's why I've been encouraging business and business leaders to embrace a more collective bargaining approach, which actually a lot of them say, may not understand what they say sometimes, when they talk about stakeholder capitalism, and move away from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. Well, if you're into that, here's one expression of it. Move towards a collective bargaining consistent with the European Commission's push.
Thanks, Danny. Just so I can get an indication, so could you just wait for a minute, please? Just so I get an indication of how many people want to ask questions, because anybody who has a question, could they stick up their hand? Because I certainly know that I have one that I'm holding on to. Just stand. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Donald Denham, victim of mandatory retirement at the age of 65. How do you address the criticism of social partnership, that because it delivers directly to both employer and employee, is deleterious to the membership of trade unions, and I suspect maybe of some of the employer bodies as well? And I appreciate very much your insightful comments on the size of government and the fact that it's shrinking, and very interesting it is there. But given that, how do you react to the prospect, each of you, to a Sinn Féin government?
Well, Kevin, maybe start with you on that one.
Well, I think in my opening remarks, I tried to at least reference the fact that certainly for social partnership, for the duration of social partnership, I think, you know, maybe everyone took their eye off the ball in connecting, you know, what was going on in the agreements with the ordinary worker on the ground. And it certainly, in general, now this is, you know, it was 20 years or whatever, and there was lots of to and fro and disputes over that period. But in general, it seemed to weaken the connection between workers in jobs and the negotiations. So the level of activism declined, but arguably since the demise of social partnership, it hasn't recovered. So maybe unfair to blame it all on social partnership. But so I think there is a need for a greater connection between, you know, educating and politicizing people so that they see, you know, social dialogue, if it was to work well, and the connection with the political system is really important. So in terms of the question, specific question about well, if Sinn Féin are in government, they'll be in government like any other party. I would like to think that they would be amenable to a deeper form of social dialogue, and I would certainly argue in terms of the need to achieve big things quickly, that social dialogue, if it was got right, might just be the key piece of that.
I might go reverse. On the Sinn Féin government, because the question has been asked now for about 6 or 7 years, both internationally and domestically, my comment is that the incumbent government appears to have been putting quite a lot of what Sinn Féin said they would do in place already, in terms of when it comes to the labour market, going back to those costs I talked about. Sinn Féin have certainly been moving in terms of their rhetoric around how they would deal with the economy. It appears they do understand that this is a golden goose at the moment, and that golden goose is actually laying the eggs that potentially could bring forward their central objective, which is the reunification. And it's on that reunification process that I have a concern about, that might distinguish a more dominant Sinn Féin government, because I don't believe they'll be alone, is that there may be a bigger push or a narrative around a border poll or reunification play faster than we actually have laid down the process for that. And where I see this, a whole myriad of issues as a citizen about it, but where I see this is that we will have failed to learn a significant lesson, the one I pointed out earlier, that the Scottish referendum in itself, even prior to Brexit, was a freezing moment in the investment story, that uncertainty about jurisdictional and constitutional change can start an investment freeze a long way out from even the act of taking up a vote. So I'd be worried that that might be a distinguishing feature from Sinn Féin. Otherwise, I agree with Kevin, it's pretty consistent, I would think, with the incumbent governments at the moment. And then the final piece on the social partnership is that for another day, but I think the greatest achievement of social partnership actually was for the individual. And the point about the individual was that the individuals could actually stay in this country, because what it was breaking was that unrelenting emigration and forced emigration aspects. And in fact, going back to social dialogue, perhaps we could have been better on the cost of living issue with a much more consistent signalling effect on the labour market in recent times as well, but that's a moot point. So final piece I would say on this is that if the old social partnership mantra was modest wage growth, industrial peace and tax cuts, this generation, it is modest wage growth, social wage increases, industrial peace, and tax rises. And that actually, of course, is a very hard thing to sell, but that's what social dialogue needs to be about, to finance a bigger state, to finance the Western European social model that we actually now are in a position to be able to afford, and by doing so, it underpin our prosperity. I think that's where maturity is, and that others are still, certainly from the right, banging out the tax cutting agenda all the time and still wondering why our social infrastructure isn't able to match what they need. So I think that's where the bravery would be in a new social dialogue if we got to that point where tax rises were part of the equation.
Thank you. I think Anne Speed had her hand up in the air.
Yes, thank you, Tom. A couple of observations and a question. I think Danny's last comment, I find myself broadly in agreement with the headings he puts on the conversation we have to have about social dialogue. I think trade unions shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Wasn't that social partnership was a bad idea, it was how the trade union movement utilised it, and we didn't address the tax question, but we recognise it now. Another observation is, I think Danny is right when he talks about Ireland having a farming sector of significant importance to the evolution of our economy and our state. I remember as a former employee of the Irish Transport Union, the relationship that John O'Carroll had, a former president, with the farmers' organisation, and the emphasis that the old ITG put on including that community in conversation about Ireland. But a question to Danny is, and he talked about the shrinking of the state, which I think is a key challenge. We need more reliance on good public policy, public investments. His description of Ardnacrusha and Intel, I think, sums it all up. What I want to know is, will the employers oppose more emphasis on public ownership, public investments, the housing crisis being a key illustration of what happens if you don't? I would like to think, at least for the employers that Danny represents, that they will not oppose a new emphasis on that in a new government, no matter who it's led by. Thanks.
Making one distinction, public ownership versus greater public provision. I think enlightened businesses, enlightenment starts with joining IBEC, so by definition all IBEC members are enlightened. But we'll see that the social fabric, the social infrastructure, so there is an agreement that the horse has bolted on increasing the size of the financing of the social labour market issues, those right to disconnect, the living wage, etc. There's no hue and cry to reverse those from our caucus. On the public ownership piece, that's more ideological. Some have put forward this for the housing. We certainly be for more social housing, more affordable housing, and how they're delivered through mechanisms of the state. But some people were putting forward the idea of an ESB for housing. I just don't see that as logical at all. This is an acute problem at the moment, and we can solve it. We've done it before. People might like how it's done. At the moment, it comes down to a mantra as we don't want to make builders rich, and we want more houses. First one's the operative one. Having to get over that, and it'll take us way too long to set up a state provision of housing, because, as I said earlier, it'll be competing with the private sector, who've already been using the same builders to make extensions to existing housing stock, to put in greater offices, industrial-based data centres. Construction's had a great 10 years, just haven't built houses because they weren't incentivized to do so, and the developers were pilloried for too long, and they just went elsewhere.
Okay, thanks, Danny. I don't think anybody else had their hand up, so I have a question, perhaps, to address something. I'm sorry, was there somebody? No? Okay. Just noting what Kevin said there about the lack of enthusiasm to go back to national wage bargaining, something that struck me, and I think I'd be interested in hearing what you both have to say about it. Can you make social dialogue anything other than purely consultative if it's not grounded in national wage bargaining, other than obviously in the sort of crisis that we saw in the time of COVID, when it had to be all hands to the pump? In ordinary circumstances, is it possible to create a model of social dialogue that's more than consultative if it's not underpinned by national wage bargaining?
I think it is, and I think it would be different to the social partnership pay agreements, but the fact of the matter is, we have in the private sector employers and businesses have very different states at play. The challenges for some of the sectors, particularly the challenges in sectors where we're organised, can be quite different from the more profitable sectors, but you can certainly, I think, set a context for bargaining that helps to ensure that the kind of issues I talked about in terms of resilience and sustainability are centre stage for the economy as a whole. Interestingly enough, I think my sense of it is, as you mentioned earlier, I'm chair of the Public Services Committee of Congress, and we're gearing up, I suppose, for a negotiation on public service pay. And I think on this occasion, and probably over the last year or two as well, I think things have shifted a little bit. I think that has a resonance across the economy. It was always the case that public service pay kind of looked to developments in the private sector, whereas I think now there is an onus on government as an employer, as well as a policy maker, to ensure that we get an agreement that addresses the cost of living crisis and sends a good signal to bargaining across the economy, both to employers and to workers.
Danny?
I do think it's possible, and I might put what is a personal view of where I think this could go. I'm not sure to get there, and you can see, and when you hear what I say, you realize why, as a business representative, but also IBEC itself is quite a big organization now. We have 300 staff, and so as a CEO, I look at our wage bill as well as you're trying to project it forward. I would like us to get to a point where we have a centralized social wage bargaining. And if that's centralized social wage bargaining, in its essence, would have a commitment, and it revolves the labor market, and so by extension, it involves that taxation piece that relates to the labor market, pay-related social insurance, it's where the action is taking place, is that given what we've just gone through, which is kind of the stealth piece, if we had negotiated those, we'd be able to say, right, whatever it might be, the statutory sick pay or the auto-enrollment, this is going to push up our wage bill for you, the individual, by 2% this year. So now that's 2% of the social wage part that we're paying. Let's have a conversation about your wage. And that can be done at the enterprise level. But we know what the cost was coming on the social wage increase per year, and that will be centralized, negotiated, including the taxation implications of it as to how to fund it. And then we'd have, at least when we get to the enterprise or perhaps sectoral level pay bargaining, we would know what the social wage cost of the employer was each year as we went along. Right now, today, employers are negotiating wages, and then on top of that, coming from the government, in comes a social wage on those items, which actually are pushing up the wage bill in a way that the employee may not be aware of, but the employers will be aware of it, because in time it's going to erode their competitiveness, and in the future they could be stranded with too high a wage bill, and then we know where that goes next. It's either a head count down or trying to renegotiate more modest wage growth, which may be behind inflation again. So my desire in the social dimension is that there's no desire to go back to centralized wage bargaining in its traditional way, but actually now we're moving into a much more social wage context, becoming chunkier in terms of its cost. I think there is a role for a social dialogue to negotiate centrally on that aspect, so that every employer in the country knows, and every employee, that it was negotiated on behalf by the trade union and their employer representative and agreed there, and that would give the context to the negotiations for the private wage, for want of a better description, negotiations. That's what I have in mind.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're more or less time out. Yeah, I see Jack nodding his head. It's the sort of discussion that could go on for hours, I think, but I think we've given it a fairly good run. So thanks very much to both of you for your presence here today. And again, particular thanks to Danny, who henceforth will be known as Red Danny. And thanks to Kevin as well for being here. Thank you, folks.